Now let's talk about some semicolon tips that'll help you in identifying incorrect answers, which is just as powerful as identifying correct answers. We always want to look at our answer choices and eliminate as much as possible. So we have the semicolon and here. Never, never, never. You never do a semicolon and a fanboy. Never. It's just not allowed. So just remember that. So if you see semicolon and, semicolon but, semicolon or in an answer choice, it is not the correct answer. You can use semicolons and subordinating conjunctions like the ones here, and I'm going to get into this in a minute. However and therefore are called subordinating conjunctions, and we can start sentences with them. You can start a sentence with however. You can start a sentence with therefore, and you have to put a comma after them. These are often used as transitional words at the beginning of a sentence, but you can put them at the front of the sentence. Therefore, you can have semicolon, however, comma, and then the independent clause here on this side, and there would be an independent clause on this side. Same with therefore. Let's see it in action so I can show you. All right. We attended the conference and we were able to see some amazing speakers. Well, right away, this should set you off that this is incorrect. Semicolon fanboy, no, 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 no. This would be the correct way to write it. We attended the conference, independent clause, and we were able to see some amazing speakers. We were able to see some amazing speakers. Another independent clause, comma, and would be the proper punctuation here. And then if I wanted to stay with the semicolon, we could say, we attended the conference, independent clause. We were able to see some amazing speakers. Another independent clause. Just use the semicolon. You do not need the and there. The semicolon is just like a period, except we use it to just make a continuation of the sentence when both sides are related. Now let's take a look at it with however and therefore. So we have an independent clause up top here. We attended the conference. Then we have a semicolon, however. However essentially means but I always say to my students that it's kind of it's a better word for but, especially when you're starting a sentence. You would never start a sentence or a formal sentence with but. You might do it on a text message or in a blog or an email or something like that, but you would never start a sentence with it. So you would never have semicolon but you can use semicolon however, and here it works. We have the independent clause, we attended the conference, and then we say, however, we were unable to see the keynote because we were late. So we have the however, comma, we were unable to see the keynote. That works. That's another independent clause here. I could, if I wanted to, put a period after conference and capitalize the however, and that would work on its own. That's why we can use the semicolon. You can use the however and the semicolon there. So we can start sentences with these subordinating conjunctions. Now, you would never use the semicolon and a lowercase because, but you would start a sentence with because. And let me show you how you would do that. We typically use subordinating conjunctions. These are words like because, although, since, however, things like that, to connect two independent clauses without punctuation. So let me show you here. I didn't want to go to the party. That's an independent clause. Because I was exhausted from a long day at work. So I'm basically saying I didn't want to go to the party because I was exhausted from a long day at work. This because here is separating I didn't want to go to the party and I was exhausted from a long day at work. We have two independent clauses here and we have because. You do not need the comma before because. Remember that. Do not choose comma because. That's another thing they'll put on the test. If you see comma because, it's the wrong answer. Okay? Same with this. I ended up going to the party, although I was exhausted. Although does not need a comma before it. It is a subordinating conjunction. So think of subordinating conjunctions as strong conjunctions, and think of coordinating conjunctions like fanboys as weak conjunctions. Subordinating conjunctions do not need the comma. Fanboys do need the comma. We have it here. She has not been able to see her friends much since she has returned from living abroad. Since is a subordinating conjunction, and you do not need a comma in between much and since. Now let's take a look at what this looks like when we put the subordinating conjunctions first. Now you've probably been told by some teacher incorrectly that you cannot start a sentence with because, but yes, you can. When you turn the subordinating conjunction because into a dependent clause at the front of the sentence and it's followed by a comma, you can use it. So we have here, because I was exhausted from a long day at work, comma, I didn't want to go to the party. Well, the independent clause here is, I didn't want to go to the party. That's the independent clause. Because I was exhausted from a long day at work is the dependent clause. When you push the subordinating conjunction in front of what was once an independent clause, I was exhausted from a long day at work was an independent clause. But I put this because in front of it. That changes it to a dependent clause. When we do that, we need this comma here, but this is correct. What you wouldn't do is, let me just erase this here. This is what your teacher was talking about when she said, or he said, you can't start a sentence with because. You wouldn't do, I didn't want to go to the party, period, capital B, because I was exhausted from a long day at work. That would be incorrect. But you can say, because I was exhausted from a long day at work, comma, I didn't want to go to the party. Perfectly fine. Same thing here. Although I was exhausted, comma, I ended up going to the party. I ended up going to the party is the independent clause. I is the noun. Ended up going is the verb phrase. And although I was exhausted is the dependent clause. The comma here works. It's perfect. And then again with the since returning from living abroad, there we have the dependent clause, which was once on the other part of the sentence, but we put it in the front. We have the comma. She has not seen her friends much. Independent clause, that is a sentence. So that's when you can take subordinating conjunctions and put them in the front. Mainly you're going to see this working, probably they'll leave out a comma or something like that, but you will see comma because in the answer choices or comma although in the answer choices, and that will be incorrect. So again, just say no to comma because. All right, but say yes to the subordinating conjunction in the subject, or I mean in the dependent clause of the sentence with a comma and an independent clause. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about however and why it's okay to use it with the semicolon. If I were to say, I was open to new ideas for the remodel, that's a sentence, I put a period there. However, comma, I wanted to stay with a mid-century modern theme. I have my transitional word here, however, comma, I wanted to stay with a mid-century modern theme. That's why this semicolon here works, because we would start a sentence with however, and you can see that the only difference is that I put the semicolon there and I lowercase the however. That is perfectly acceptable. You would never do this. I was open to new ideas for the remodel, period, but no, 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 because a fanboy is not strong enough to start a sentence. And you would never, and that's why you would never put semicolon but here. That would be wrong as well. So pay attention to that.